All right, so Sarah, I'm sure you've heard this too, but I think especially recently, most of us say we'd speak up and do the right thing, right? That we not conform to horrible societal standards. And let me give you an example, because we hear that when people speak about what happened during World War II in Europe, people say the exact same thing about standing up to the Nazis. And in that, I think like the question is, would you actually have been part of the resistance, knowing the risk included not only social shunning, but indeed death?
Right? I think it's a really interesting question to ask ourselves because at the same time that we hear so many believe fervently that they would have done something, they would have been part of this resistance, we hear nowadays that so many people have a hard time speaking up when it comes to interrupting moments of racism, sexism, misogyny, ageism, homophobia, you name it, right? It can be really intimidating to use your voice, let alone using your voice when there are such high risks to your social status. And as you said, maybe even to your life, right? You want to do the right thing, but what we're hearing is some people feel like, I don't have all the information. I don't know what to say. I don't know what the repercussions, and therefore they stay silent.
Mm, so true. And we're here to say that if there ever was a time for us to use our voice, from interrupting with people who want to take away very actively other people's rights, to promoting equity, to looking out for ourselves by getting what we need from relationships and communities, and in using our right to vote in the voting booths this fall, because yes, a vote can be your voice as well. Now is that time.
We're so grateful that we get to bring to you a meaningful and our favorite practical conversation that can help you really reframe your understanding of why we become silent and how to unlearn all of that intentionally so we can start using our really powerful voices once again. Welcome to the Dear White Women podcast, the show that helps white women use their privilege to uproot systemic racism without centering themselves in the process. We are your multi-ethnic best friends, Sarah and me, Sasha.
Elaine, would you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Absolutely. I am a recovering lawyer turned accidental author. And maybe that says enough. But in case it doesn't, I was that precocious child that said, I want to be a lawyer, went to law school, ended up not practicing, spent more than a decade in leadership development, and really was looking at what do I think is missing from how we're talking about communication, collaboration, negotiation, and landed on this topic of silence, which I know we'll get into. So I am now the author of Unlearning Silence, How to Speak Your Mind, Unleash Talent, and Live More Fully.
That first sentence was enough for me. I was like, great, recovering lawyer,
Yeah.
got it. Because from the introduction of Unlearning Silence, right, I saw a lot of myself in this book, not just because we have that in common, but a lot of the ways in which we've approached silence and I've thought about it. I think when I was reading the words, it was like you were specifically talking to me a lot of the time, which is the hallmark of a really great book, right? And I loved how personal and practical you make this content because that's something that we care deeply about through this platform as well. And let's start with the title, right? Because your title is Unlearning Silence, which sort of implies that we've learned along the way how to quiet ourselves. And so I really want to talk about learned silence because this part really jumped out at both of us from the very start of your book. And that is kids ask roughly 125 questions per day. Adults ask about 6 questions per day. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, we silence our curiosity. And I will say, as the mother of a newly 10-year-old whose favorite thing in the world to do is ask questions, he might be at 375 questions a day, sort of really just ramping that up. But it is true. As we get older, we stop asking questions. And it's something that I think a lot about a lot of the time. And Sarah's heard me get on my soapbox about this. So how does this happen? And what are the ramifications of becoming silent, especially when we think about it where we are right now with everything going on in the world?
Yeah. And I have to say, writing a book on unlearning silence really messes with your parenting because when my kid starts asking, I think our kids could be friends, question number 267, and it's only noon, I'm like, dude, just Mom needs a minute. I need a minute. And then I'm thinking, how do I balance that with wanting to continue to cultivate your curiosity? Because that reaction from parents, from educators, from teachers, from caregivers to what is rewarded in a classroom is how we learn to stay silent, right? If you continue to ask those questions, you become disruptive. We only have 30 minutes for this segment in class. So if we're going over because I got to stay on track because I need to then have you perform to the standardized test, we learn to silence that curiosity because there's no room or space for it. And the ramifications are over time, we as human beings stop thinking for ourselves. We regurgitate to teach to the test. And I say this as someone who has benefited from that learning over time, right? I took the SATs or whatever standardized test, the LSATs, and then went to Harvard Law School. I benefited from playing in that system. And it took me a long time to realize that I actually, A, can ask questions, B, have thoughts of my own, because it translates in the workplace as you're rewarded for being an easy team player. You're a good team player, you're easy to work with, you make other people look good, you execute on their ideas, and you don't push back. The ramifications are groupthink. The ramifications are loss of critical thinking. The ramifications are really many of us living in a skewed sense of reality. If as a leader you don't have other people offering different perspectives, you only have that one train of thought. And then, as a matter of power dynamics, it also gets reinforced. So we see that in our politics today, in our inability to hear one another, to accept those differences, to hold the both and the complexity, and also not really addressing a lot of the issues that we need to address because some of our leaders don't want to hear it, don't have the capacity to hear it, and we may or may not be rewarded for actually articulating a different perspective.
So such a well said perspective on what I think are pretty devastating consequences of not listening. And I relate to what you said about schooling, because I remember joking, not joking, that even though I went to a great public school, I don't think I really learned how to think critically until I was in college and to ask more meaningful questions and have the space and time to be encouraged to do that. But then I'd love to actually switch gears then, because I think a lot of people, at least in their own minds, in my mind, I ask questions. I am curious. I speak up. I tend to, but I think if anybody's listening and hoping to have an impact, to use their voice, being like, well, I would speak up. Like a lot of people say, well, if I was living during slavery, I would have done something different, right? We have these perspectives about ourselves, but we also know, certainly based on the work that Misasha and I do, a lot of people grapple with when or how they can speak up, or actually really have a hard time speaking up. They're finding themselves sort of paralyzed from interrupting moments where it would be very helpful to speak up. So you laid out some really great questions, sort of like this framework that each of us, whether it's intentional or not, wrestle with around when to use our voice and silence. So you say, what are the costs of choosing to use your voice? What are the benefits of staying silent? And given the cost and benefit of each, what makes sense to me? And it almost struck me that we're making these split-second decisions, weighing the answers to those questions. Can you talk to us a bit about how these questions show up for all of us in our both in our personal and professional lives, and what's the best framework for these questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So the costs of using your voice are, exactly what you described. What words do I actually use? And also if I'm a post processor, meaning I actually process best after the fact, sort of in a delayed reaction, it feels like my moment might have passed. So if I can't figure out what I want to say, much less how I want to say it, and the moment has passed, then to use my voice, I've got to answer all those questions. And that's also time and energy, and I'm reading the room, and it seems like everyone wants to move on to the next agenda item, or the meeting has ended and we've all clicked out of Zoom. There's a cost to just figuring out how to do that, as well as how are other people going to receive it? So what defensiveness am I going to have to deal with? What retaliation, technical or not technical retaliation, am I going to have to deal with? What impact is it going to have on our relationship? Those are a lot of the costs that are front and center. And of course, because human beings, we tend to try to mitigate risk. then silence becomes really attractive. If I don't say something, I don't have to address any of those questions. I don't have to worry about the status quo of our relationship and whether trust in the relationship is going to take a hit. Even if the status quo isn't great, at least I know what it is. And the benefits of staying silent, those become some of the benefits of staying silent, particularly when we're oversubscribed and too busy, right? It's like, well, just move on to the next thing in my list. And I don't see the long-term impact of losing that ability to think critically or be curious until 10 years down the line, or 5 years down the line, or 5 months into the project when, oh, I really should have said something because that thing that I was worried about is now happening. And the other piece of this is what is not necessarily visible to most people, right? Each of us only have so much bandwidth. And so it can be easy to say, you've got to speak up. Modern day slavery or genocide, Palestine, elections. There's so many different things going on right now. Easy to say, well, you should be speaking up. And in this way, that makes you a good person. If you're not doing it, therefore you're a bad person. And the weight is there. And if I think about each of our own lives, right? How much did you sleep last night? What caregiving responsibilities do you have? Are you in this country on a visa that if you lost employment, you would no longer be living in this country? How many of those things are visible, not visible? Which takes me to agency. It's not to say that we always say everything to everyone. The world is too noisy and complex for that, or that we stay silent all the time. But A, are you aware of when you're staying silent? Are you choosing to stay silent for strategic reasons, to play the long game, for bandwidth reasons, for self-care, self-preservation? Any number of reasons. Are you actively choosing that, or is that a subconscious default? Because as you noted, those calculations are split second. They're typically unconscious. And my aim is to surface that awareness of when are we staying silent? And are we choosing that, or is that just learned behavior and our habit over time? Is there agency in it? That would be a key question.
I think that the part about agency is so, so important and something that I didn't really think about in myself until much later in life, and I think about this in both the professional sense, in meetings, or, in my time in big law, for example, lots of instances there, but I think about it in my personal life as well. So I think that is such an important piece, and I'm so glad that you talked about it. I want to talk about or ask about rather, when we use our voices and the mental model around that. And I actually think about this less in the professional sense and more in the personal sense, and specifically around travel baseball, because I spend a lot of time now. And this is going to be like, yeah, this is a niche thing, but I think it applies in this sense, right? Because you talk about sort of the three dimensions of negotiation as discussed by the Harvard Negotiation Project. And, what does your voice sort of provide? The conversation, is it substance? Is it relationship? Or is it process? And I've heard a lot of voices provide none of that a lot of the time. But I think this is so cool because it's such a great way to frame this in a way that I hadn't really thought about quite like this before. So can you break down what these mean and the practical tips around, how to use these buckets to further your own voice?
Yeah, absolutely. And this observation came out of my being a mediator. As a mediator, you are holding space for other people to have the conversation, and you're holding the process, right? And noticing how often we aren't able to do that when things are heated, when we feel strongly, or when we disagree. So the three levers to using your voice are: one is substance. That's the what. What are we actually talking about? If we're negotiating a contract, it's terms and conditions. In travel baseball, it might be logistics. I'm making this up because it's not a niche I know.
I mean, it could be literally anything. Yeah.
But substance is the what. Relationship is the who. So who's even part of the conversation? Part of silence is if you're not included in the conversation, but it's not just the who, it's the level of trust, how we feel about each other. And fundamentally, you think about the people in your life that you like, you're more likely to want to say yes to them, work with them. If you don't like people, you don't trust them, then it actually impacts what you're willing to agree to in terms of substance. So substance is the what, relationship is the who, process is the how. How are we going about having this conversation? Or in our personal lives, how are we going about having the relationship? Is it purely text-based? And that tends to benefit people who are more digital natives. What's missing in terms of affect or understanding or communication if we're just using that mode or medium? And so often when people think about using their voice, we think about the substance, right? I need to take a stand or have a stance on this issue. And we forget that how people feel treated, who we're interacting with, and also how we're going about the process, right? Are we taking a break in this 4-hour meeting? Is it virtual? Is it in person? All of that actually impacts the what. So if we're concerned about using our voice because I'm not the subject matter expert in travel baseball, we can still be thinking about the relationship, how people feel, who's involved, and the process of how might we go about interacting with one another. And those are huge leverage points for influencing an outcome, having an impact that are really under considered in our very singular focus on being subject matter experts in the substance. So wanted to offer that frame of even if you're not the SME in this topic, you can still have a voice. And by voice, I don't just mean the words that you say in a meeting, I mean how you move through the world, the things that you care about, the values that you bring to life by tending to the relational aspect and tending to how are we actually going about things. So often that meme, this meeting could have been an email, rings true. And it's because we haven't stopped to think, why do we have this meeting? Why is it at 9 o'clock in this time zone? Oh, because we inherited that process from a project manager 2 project managers ago. And so what process might actually work better given the current players and circumstance? And to be asking those questions really do have an impact. And that impact is a key piece of voice.
So I've got a lot of people in the youth sports industrial complex that I would like you to talk to about these very ideas, because I think that this transcends, I think people think a lot about negotiation or mediation or these levers in a professional sense, but I want to keep highlighting how this is so important for us in our personal relationships as well. And I think you did such a great job of doing that just now. And also, I think that is, really important for us to consider when we think about our own agency, right? And how we show up using our voice. And then you also take this in a slightly different direction. You talk about in how we silence others, these sort of 3 buckets or groups of people in our lives, like those who decide, those to consult, and those who need to be informed. And for me, that takes it, out of our own agency into these relationships, right? And this importance with our relationship with silence and voice. So can you talk about more about these people in our lives and why this sort of framework is really important when we're considering, when and how to use our voices?
Yeah, absolutely. The 3 buckets framework says in each topic, there are 3 categories of people. And talking about personal life, I think the illustration I use in the book is actually when I was dating as to who decides, who should be consulted, and who is just informed. Now, coming from a family that immigrated from Taiwan, my parents had the assumption that they would be in the decide bucket when it came to who I was dating. As someone who grew up in California, I did not have that same assumption. In fact, a well-meaning person in my life at the time said, that dating is an individual sport, not a team sport, right? And I was like, oh, you clearly are not from my family. So whether it's where are we going for vacation, what are we eating for dinner, or in the business world, it can be racy models of, who do you need to consult, decide, and there's spreadsheets for all of this. Where we get tripped up so often in using our voice is thinking that if we use our voice, it will influence the decision and the outcome. And that if it doesn't, somehow we've failed. And one of the traps then is that we think that if we're using our voice, we're putting ourselves in the decide bucket. Or as well-intentioned leaders or human beings, it feels like we now need to consult everyone. To be inclusive means to consult everyone and take everyone's opinion into account. I often talk about this with teams I'm working with. If you are the CEO, you should not be deciding or consulted on what is served for lunch at this event. That is not a good use of your billable hours or your brain space. And so if you can't delegate and let someone else make that decision, there's a different series of questions that we need to ask. So there are the people who decide, and their responsibility is to consult and listen to different perspectives and be really clear that they're making the decision. And at the end of the day, also be accountable for that decision. The second bucket is the people that you consult with. You ask for their perspective. And the reality is the world cannot run on consensus, or we cannot poll everyone. And so let's be clear. Why am I consulting Sarah in this case and not consulting Miss Sasha, right? What is it? And have that clarity. So often, if people are in the consult bucket, then and they don't see the influence ending in the decision making, they think, well, it was useless, right? If you as a leader already knew what you were going to do, why did you go through the motions, quote unquote, to ask me for my thought? But that is that separation between, oh, I'm being consulted, I'm not actually a decision maker. And then the third bucket is inform. You're not consulted, you're not a decision maker. You show up and you figure out what's served for lunch at this event. And we should all rotate between those different buckets on different topics, given our expertise, given our role. And a key piece of it is just having that clarity of, oh, on this topic, I should not even be consulted and I should be informed. This topic, I'm being consulted, but let me be really clear with myself. Being consulted doesn't mean I'm the decision maker. The decision maker is going to listen to a bunch of different perspectives and then make a call and own that call. So often I am asking the question, who owns the decision? And a lot of times that's unclear, in part because no one wants to own it, or because we've never stopped to think about it. But having that clarity and even that negotiation of who goes in what bucket really allows us to show up well. If I'm being consulted, let me advocate as hard as I can with the data and perspective I have, and also let go at the end of the day, since I'm not the decision maker and I'm not owning it.
The pressure that was just relieved from my brain when you framed it was great, because I feel like when you laid out that just because you use your voice, you don't necessarily become the decision maker, right? So you don't have to be as afraid about messing everything up just because you spoke up. It gives you more freedom to be able to speak up. And I also think personally, we were talking about how so much of this can apply personally. As a parent of teenagers, this is a really great framework, because you're in a stage of life where I feel like these kids want to get more independence, want to have more autonomy, want to be able to make more decisions, but there will be times where they are allowed to decide. And there are other times where the parents still will decide, maybe consult them, or other times you're just going to be told, kid, that this is what is happening. And so I feel like that's a great tool for parents of teenagers as well.
I love that. I keep trying to coach myself that it is a tool useful for raising a 6-year-old as well, because, and this is my own unlearning, why am I consulting my son on what we're eating for dinner? Oh, because I was never consulted and I want to have a voice. But just because he says he doesn't want Brussels sprouts doesn't mean I can't make them. Because at the end of the day, I'm still the decision maker. At least that's the current negotiated outcome in our family, because, if you don't want to eat it, then maybe you should start cooking.
I love that. Yeah. You want to come talk to my kids about that one too? That'd be great. I want to circle back to the one thing that we raised our family with was this sense of time affluence. I've said it for years that I want to create a sense of time affluence for our kids, for our family. And we talked both about the CEO, like the CEO should not be making decisions about what's served for lunch because they have other things to do with their time. But even at the beginning of this conversation, when we talked about how teachers can limit, we only have 30 minutes. Time seems to be a big contributor that we don't talk about when it comes to cultural silence. And I know there's a part in your book where you talk about how our hyper-connected culture, we're like operating at hyper speed, we're rushing, we're busy, and it can unintentionally silence people. The example you gave in your book was when you're standing on a street corner or walking across the street and you fire off an email on your phone right before you're walking into the next meeting without stopping to think about what or why the person is really asking you that thing in email. Can we talk a little bit about why it is helpful for us to slow down? What is the role time plays in silence? And is it worth, like on a practical side of, is it worth checking? I haven't done this, but how many times do I pick up my phone in a day? How many swipes, taps, and clicks am I making? What are some of the things we can do to talk about the influence of time on our silence or voice?
I'm going to take a beat here and just give us some time, because this is the positive aspect of silence, right? The calls to action of we need, take a moment of silence, meditation and mindfulness, saying, let's slow down and actually be present. If we want to use the language of slow thinking and fast thinking, reflective versus reactive, all of that goes back to intentionality and making sure that we're not operating on autopilot, as well as, is there space, and time is part of space, not to get too philosophical about it, is there space for different processing styles, for post-processors, right? To go and have the 20 minutes that it takes, or for tech people, the cache and compile, I think was the analogy, to really digest and be thoughtful. That I think the action is, how do we interrogate what is artificial time pressure? Meaning, most conversations or relationships don't actually fit into 30-minute blocks of time. And so often we don't talk about things because it's like, I can't open up that can of worms. There's no way to shove it all back in when I need to jump into my next thing. So in what ways are there artificial blocks to how we're trying to live life? In what ways are we just oversubscribed? We can talk about cost of living, particularly in the Bay Area, where we, all have a reference point that society was not built for 2-career households that you're then trying to piece it together and juggle. And there's no easy or quick fix for that.
This is such a great sort of segue to our, what I'd like to talk about next, because a lot of this hyper pressure and, you were just talking about how society wasn't built for sort of this, level of cost of living and the constant stress and the go and the requirements of 2 working parents, and, where there's a disproportionate childcare burden and so many other things that I think, have failed us as like on a societal level. And, obviously, Sarah and I spend a lot of time talking about making change, both on the part of the individual, but also and largely about the systems, right, that we operate in and that we as individuals need to work on to change. And so I really love the part in your book where you outline how we can practically unlearn systemic silence, right? Because a lot of what we talked about thus far has been sort of the individual with hints of the system around it as well. So can you share some of your practical tips around unlearning systemic silence with us?
Yeah, it to me starts with even the awareness that silence is baked into our systems, which we're still debating or trying to convince people of. And to me, reality is any policy is going to support certain people with certain identities and often silence, often unintentionally, other groups of people. So the 2 questions to ask around any policy, and we'll get into practice, is, who does this policy support? Who does this policy silence? Is it working parents? Is it people with long commutes? I mean, why are we still talking about return to office with so much friction 4 years later? Because it disproportionately silences people with longer commutes, caregiving responsibilities, people who benefit from flexibility, etc. And it supports people who are familiar with leading in person, shorter commutes, etc. And so just ask those questions. Who does this support? Who's this silence? And the silence, of course, is both who is not represented or considered in this, as well as who is disadvantaged. And then the question of practice, because a policy is only as good as its implementation. And often there is a disconnect between what we say the rules and norms are and how things actually play out, the practice. How much alignment is there between our policy and our practice? And in what ways is that intentional? In what ways is that out of whack? And what do we want to do about it? I mean, talking about changing a system can feel incredibly overwhelming. But if we think about it, a system is a collection of norms that are reinforced by people's behavior over time. And so the reason that we've spent so much time thinking about individual silence or relational, interpersonal silence is because it impacts the bandwidth, the ability that we have to impact or examine even systemic silence. So I'd start with those two questions to be at least intellectually honest about what's working, what's not working, who it's impacting, and then really prioritizing where do you want to start? What do you want to change? You can't change everything overnight, but each of us working on the things that we care about over time, that is how change, behavior change, systemic change takes place.
Absolutely. Obviously, we could talk for a long, long time, but is there anything else that we haven't asked that you would like to share with us or with our audience?
For me, one of the big tragic things about silence is loneliness and social isolation. That the more we stay silent, the less we talk about things, the more we as human beings tend to internalize that, oh, we're the problem, right? I'm the only one who can't hack it. I'm the only one who's struggling. The things that we don't know about in our families, our family secrets, the generational trauma, the things that happen at work that are actually systemic, but that we internalize as personal or interpersonal flaws. That to me, even if we can't solve the root pain, right? Like I can't cure cancer, but the double pain of feeling like you have to carry the cancer diagnosis and hide it from everyone is something that we can solve for together. And that includes my being willing to share and the people around me being able to hear it and receive it. That feels like at least we're in it together rather than further divided. Would be a key piece of why unlearning silence matters so much to me. If nothing else, can we see each other and create space for each other to be human beings rather than in our own silos thinking of it's me, I'm the problem, and I've got to fix it myself.
Unintentional quoting of Taylor Swift right there, but
totally unintentional.
I love that because, given the focus we've had on loneliness in society right now, the Surgeon General's warning about loneliness, like there's a topic of the American Psychological Association. This really fits in and gives that why should we care in such a simple yet heavy, meaningful way. It's about human connection. It's about being able to be our true selves, see each other, hear our stories, and stay connected. And we need to speak up and use our voices if we're going to do that. So thank you for giving that perspective. Where can everyone find you and your book?
Yeah, the book is available wherever books are sold. If you are not sick of the sound of my voice, I am the one who narrates the audiobook. Otherwise, there's hard copy and large print wherever books are sold with a plug for your local indie bookstore. And then I'm on LinkedIn and Instagram at Elaine Lynn Herring.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing this time with us.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
You've just listened to the Dear White Women podcast with your hosts, Sarah and Misasha. Yes, we're on social media. And yes, you can hire us to do talks about our book. But the biggest thing, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter to receive our free materials. Head over to dearwhitewomen.com to get on the list.